Hello, my name is Patrick Lambrix, and I will be talking about identifying player roles in ice hockey. And this is work together with Rasmus Säfvenberg and Niklas Carlsson. I will give a short motivation, and I will talk about the roles that we identified. We use the roles to check underpaid and overpaid players within those roles. And we also give a small application on team composition. So it all started with the coach of Linköping Hockey Club asking a question. He liked this player, Marcus Hennikainen. He thought that he is a good player within his role, but you cannot really easily see this within the traditional stats. So he asked whether it was possible to evaluate the performance of this player given the data that is available and how we could compare him to other players. Now, we translated his questions into the following three. First, what are the different roles in the team for ice hockey players? We'll only look at skaters, so defenders and forwards, not the goalkeepers. It should be based on data, and the players should be able to have a combination of roles and not just be classified as a player with one particular role. Then we'd like to check which players are undervalued, overvalued according to their role and salary. And that we will do by comparing players to the players that are most similar to them within their roles. And the third question that we ask is there a successful team composition based on the roles? And we do that by comparing playoff teams and non-playoff teams and their makeup with respect to these roles. There has been work on roles earlier. For instance, at this workshop a few years ago, Jan van Haren presented work on 22 different roles in football. In ice hockey, there has been some very early work in the 90s, some work 10, 15 years ago as well. Usually K-means was used, which means that the player can only have one role. Not so much data was available, so few performance metrics were used. And of course, the game has also changed. Hockey is not played the same way nowadays than 10 or 20 years ago. So unfortunately, we cannot answer the question of the coach because we didn't have data from the Swedish league available. But we looked at the research questions using the data from the NHL season 21-22. We had play-by-play data from NHL.com, where we have information about shots, goals, penalties, hits, face-off, giveaways, and takeaways. We have shift data, which tells us which players were on the ice at which time. And we have salary data from capfriendly.com. So let's look at the roles. We only looked at players that had played at least 200 minutes over the season, which resulted in 263 defenders and 485 forwards. From the event data, we derived different stats and performance metrics, about 40, which are available in the paper. On those, we performed principal component analysis, and we ended up with 8 components for defenders and 9 for forwards. And on these, we performed fuzzy clustering using fuzzy C-means, which means that players could be clustered within different clusters with certain degrees. And for defenders, we ended up with 3 clusters, and with forwards for forward clusters. So for defenders, we found clusters D1, D2, D3. We have given them labels, but this is our own interpretation. So D1 may be the offensively oriented defenders. Among the defenders, they score the most goals, have the most assists, the most expected goals, most takeaways. They often play power play, so when the team has 1 more or 2 more players. And they often start in the offensive zone. D2 may be called the defensive specialists. They have fewer goals. They have few penalty minutes, not so many hits. They do often play close to the own net. They're also the shortest and have the lowest weight. And we have the defensively oriented defenders, which are the guys who play really physically. They're the heaviest, they take the most hits, they collect more penalty minutes, and they play box play. So when the team has fewer players on the ice than the other team. For the forwards, we have the two-way forwards, which skate the most. They play the box play. They often start in defensive zone. The offensively oriented forwards, they score many goals, many assists. They have the highest expected goal percentage. The offensive specialists actually score the most goals. They have the most assists. They have the highest expected goals. They also provoke penalties and they block shots. And finally, the defensively oriented forwards, they play physically. They're the heaviest. They tackle the most. They also collect the most penalty minutes. So let's see what we can do for comparing salaries. So for a given player, we look at the 10 nearest neighbors, and these are based on the roles that the players have together with the fuzzy membership. And then we take the Euclidean distance between these data points. And then we compare the cap hits. And based on this, we can then rank the players with respect to being underpaid or overpaid. Both underpaid and overpaid defenders, the top ones are Swedish, Oliver Kylington and Oliver Ekman Larsson. Something that was a common characteristic for many of the underpaid defenders as well as underpaid forwards was that they were on entry-level contracts. Because the first contract that you start in the NHL, the young players, and maybe their value is not that well known yet when they start with the contract. Some of those, for instance, Adam Fox, actually received a much better contract this season afterwards. For the overpaid defenders, we noticed that some of those got smaller contracts, like Anton Stålman. Danny de Keyser, for instance, got to another league. And PK Subban and Duncan Keith, they actually retired after that season. So similarly for the forwards, Marchment, Robertson, and Hughes, they got much better contracts after the season. And Alexander Radulov went to another league. So can we use the roles to say something about team composition? So what we did was we looked for each team in the NHL and we took the 18 skaters with the most minutes played. So 18 comes from the fact that normally you have 20 players in each team for each game, and 2 of them are goalkeepers. And what we noticed then was that teams that went to the playoffs had a higher proportion of forwards of role F3, which were the offensive specialists, and had lower proportion of forwards of roles F1 and F2, which were the two-way forwards and the offensively oriented forwards. There was no distinction for the F4 forwards. For defenders, we noticed that teams that went to the playoffs had a higher proportion of defenders of role D1, which were the offensively oriented defenders, and lower proportion for roles D2 and D3. There are some limitations. The data is not perfect. There are inconsistencies in the data. We don't have all events. These may be having influence. For instance, we don't have information about passes in this data. And the player's team may influence the player's playing style or player's performance. The same player may have actually different roles in different teams. So to conclude, I presented a method for clustering skaters, where we use the fuzzy method, where players can belong to different clusters with different degrees. We use the roles and salary comparison to identify some underpaid and overpaid players. And we noticed that in the 21-22 season in the NHL, there was a difference in team composition between teams that went to the playoffs and that did not go to the playoffs. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.